Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the sun-baked streets of ancient Sumer, a place where the beer was warm, the buildings were made of mud, and the average Tuesday involved more barley than you've probably seen in your entire life. Imagine this, you're trudging through the market square of Ur, a city older than Rome, older than Greece, older than your neighbor's suspiciously long-lived cat. The air is thick with the scent of wet clay, roasted onions, and something a bit sour that might be last week's beer spill. You're wrapped in a scratchy linen robe, holding a shallow basket of dates you've just bartered for, when a group of rowdy farmers trundle past. They're singing a hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of beer, but with the slurred enthusiasm that suggests they've already had their nightly ration. A child darts by with a half-crushed reed straw sticking out of her mouth like a flute, while an elderly woman scolds a dog for stealing her bowl of mash. You blink, and it's all normal. Completely ordinary. This is Sumer. Beer is everywhere. You probably wouldn't survive this place, at least not without getting a stomachache. Between the parasites in the river water and the relentless sun, your modern immune system would fold like an overcooked flatbread. But Sumerians had a solution for hydration, nutrition, and general crankiness. And it came frothy, cloudy, and sloshing in a shared jar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start walking toward the city's edge, where mud brick workshops crowd along narrow alleys and little donkeys swish their tails at flies. The scent of malted barley grows stronger. Ahead, there's a low-roofed structure with reed mats hanging in the doorway. Inside, a few figures sit cross-legged around a large ceramic pot, each with a thin reed straw poking into it. They're drinking, slowly, chatting, and laughing. You've just stumbled into one of the oldest forms of social bonding, the Sumerian beer circle. Welcome to the birthplace of beer. Or, at least, one of its earliest known incarnations. Historians still argue whether beer-making predated bread-making, or if they evolved side by side like two awkward siblings sharing a tent. But it's fairly certain that by the time the Sumerians were carving out their lives along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, some 5,000 years ago, they had fully embraced beer as a staple of daily life. They called it kvass. No, not a catchy brand name. Just their word for the thick, slightly fermented gruel they considered not only a drink, but a food group. Think of it as a smoothie you have to chew, or a very confused soup with alcoholic ambitions. The city of Ur, one of Sumer's crown jewels, bustled with this barley culture. You'd see enormous storage rooms filled with grain, huge ceramic vats for soaking and fermenting, and scribes squinting at clay tablets as they recorded who owed what, and who drank more than their share. Some days, a worker might receive their entire wage in beer. Other days, it might be docked because they spilled too much while trying to carry 2 jars at once during a dust storm. Occupational hazard. Even the architecture of Ur seemed shaped by this beer-centered way of life. Cool, shaded courtyards doubled as fermentation spaces. Roofs were designed with openings to let air and sunlight assist in the drying of mash. And while the streets themselves were dusty and cramped, almost every block had a little nook where someone was brewing something. Sometimes officially, for the temple. Sometimes not so officially, for neighbors willing to pay in fish or firewood. You can still imagine the rhythm of the city, footsteps on clay, the burble of liquid in fermenting pots, the occasional clang of a broken jar. In the evenings, the city's colors shift to gold and bronze as the sun dips behind the Ziggurat. Children stop their games to hover near beer pots, hoping for a taste. Elders gather to sip, discuss crop yields, and grumble about how beer used to taste better when barley was barley. Here's the thing, Sumerian beer wasn't anything like what you might expect. No clear lagers, no carbonated pints. This was cloudy, fibrous, and swirled with grainy sediment. You didn't pour it so much as scoop it. And drinking it without a straw? you'd be chewing half the time. Hence, the invention, perhaps not of the straw itself, which was used earlier for other purposes, but certainly of its practical daily use in beer consumption. It was a tool of courtesy and efficiency. Nobody wanted to slurp down barley husks or chew half-fermented mash. So they poked their reed straws through the foam, down into the liquid gold, filtering out the gunk. Over time, straw drinking became not just practical but ritualistic, something you did in groups, around one jar, as an act of shared sustenance. And you, dear traveler, are now sitting cross-legged, one hand resting on a warm clay jar, your other hand lifting a long, hollow reed to your lips. The taste hits you, tangy, yeasty, slightly sweet, with the faint aftertaste of yesterday's stew. Not bad. Not great. But deeply familiar, if you were born in UR, anyway. Some scholars suggest that beer in this form may have been consumed as early as 7000 BCE in the broader Fertile Crescent. But Sumerians were the ones who wrote it down, stamped it in cuneiform, and made beer part of the city's fabric. And that's what makes UR such a remarkable case study. Here, beer wasn't a luxury. It was a baseline. Even legal documents referenced it. One ancient law code outlines proper compensation for shortchanging someone on beer quality. Another outlines how much beer a worker should get in exchange for 1 day's hauling bricks. Answer: 2 liters, more if it was hot. Of course it was hot. So now, as dusk falls and the stars begin to blink to life over the desert horizon, you set down your straw, exhale, and lean back against the coolness of a temple wall. Around you, the murmurs of old stories rise and fall like waves, tales of barley gods and beer mishaps, of rainy harvests and legendary hangovers. And in that moment, surrounded by clay, stars, and the steady rhythm of a civilization built partly on mash, you feel the day slip away. The sun has set fully now, but the city of UR doesn't sleep just yet. In the dim warmth of the Sumerian evening, torchlight flickers along the walkways, and the last of the beer drinkers are settling in for quiet gossip and slow yawns. You rise from the beer circle, stomach lightly buzzing, and wander down a side alley where the faint scent of yeast clings to the air like an old memory. You pass a scribal school, its walls etched with cuneiform doodles, some sacred, some probably teenage jokes about donkeys. Up ahead, a group of apprentices is hunched around a low table, and, yes, they're not writing equations or prayer hymns tonight. They're busy recording a beer recipe. Not just how to brew it, but how to store it, share it, and dedicate it to the gods. You peer over a shoulder and see careful little wedges pressed into the wet clay. Ingredients, quantities, divine permissions. You've stumbled upon something rare and oddly touching, the earliest known recipe in the world. And surprise, it's for beer. Historians still debate whether the recipe was meant to be strictly practical, or if it also held ritual significance. The truth probably lives somewhere in between. This wasn't just about flavor profiles or foam thickness. In Sumer, beer had a spiritual role. You didn't just drink it. You honored it. You thanked the goddess Ninkasi for it. And sometimes, you drank it in her name. The hymn to Ninkasi, part poem, part brewing manual, describes a divine process of turning water and grain into something more. It speaks of noble women soaking malt in jugs, letting it ferment in the open air, then sharing it with joy and laughter. There's something comforting in the rhythm of it, like a lullaby about barley. You imagine the priestesses chanting the hymn while working in temple kitchens, their bare feet dusty from crushed grain. They stir the mash with wooden paddles, sniffing the fermenting aroma, listening for the telltale bubbling that says the gods are pleased. Beer wasn't just brewed, it was witnessed. The Sumerians didn't use hops, of course. That came millennia later. But they had date syrup, herbs, and all sorts of additions depending on taste, region, and how ambitious the brewer was feeling. Some beers were meant to knock you flat. Others were mellow enough for breakfast. Yes, breakfast. You might start your day with a bowl of thick, nutrient-rich beer. Think of it as an early smoothie, but with more foam and fewer bananas. At the center of this brewing tradition were the women. They were the main brewers in both the home and the temple. In fact, the very association of Ninkasi as a goddess, and not a god, tells you something about gender roles in Sumerian food culture. Women weren't just passive participants in daily life. They were hands-on chemists, ritual leaders, and, occasionally, tipsy storytellers. You step into a courtyard where a young woman is pouring mashed barley into a ceramic vat. She hums softly, not for you, but to the beer itself, as if calming it into readiness. Beside her, a reed mat is laid out with sprouted grains, drying slowly in the night air. This is malting, Sumer style. A few fat beetles crawl lazily across the floor, unimpressed by your presence. You don't disturb them. Further along the path, two children are playing with a broken pot, pretending it's a tavern. One asks the other to pay in imaginary fish, the other demands a better grade of beer and throws a fistful of sand. It's all very realistic. There's evidence that taverns, or alehouses, existed all across Sumer. Some were licensed by temples, others were private enterprises run by enterprising women. A clay tablet from Lagash even describes one such tavern keeper caught watering down her beer. She was fined and shamed. Quality control was serious business. You slip into a larger public hall. The walls are painted with faint traces of ochre. A few carved stools circle a central jar, tall enough to come up to your waist. This is where merchants might gather after a long day, discussing trade routes and crop failures, sipping beer with their long straws and calling for musicians. The harpist plucks out a slow, sleepy tune. No vocals, just melody, sweet and dull like a dream half-remembered. Even scribes were paid in beer. One inscription reads, "To the man who counted the sheep, 2 jugs of beer." No arguments. Sheep counting was thirsty work. But what's most intriguing is how much documentation beer earned. It appears in medical texts, legal codes, and even myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian proto-blockbuster, includes a scene where Enkidu, the wild man, is civilized by drinking beer. 7 cups, in fact. After that, he becomes wise and calm. You wonder whether that was a metaphor, or just good marketing. There's also evidence of regional variation in beer recipes. Some cities preferred darker brews, others lighter. Some favored added date sugar, others were purists. You could almost imagine a Sumerian version of a craft beer festival, just slower and with more livestock. A few French scholars have speculated whether Sumerian beer might have had mild psychoactive properties from herbs or fermentation techniques. There's no hard proof, of course, but it's fun to imagine someone zoning out under a fig tree, muttering about grain spirits and forgetting where they left their goat. So you keep walking, following the river path, now lit by moonlight. The reeds rustle softly, and somewhere, an owl hoots. Your breath carries the faint aroma of barley, and your fingers are sticky with old mash. Not unpleasant. Just textured. And suddenly, you feel it, not just the taste of Sumerian beer, but its presence. It's not a flavor. It's a rhythm. A communal pause. A reason to sit still. And maybe, after all this time, that's the real magic. You drift past a pair of night watchmen murmuring over a shared jug. They nod lazily as you pass, too relaxed to question your presence. The night deepens, but the city doesn't grow silent, just quieter, softer. You wander toward the edge of the district where brewing is more than an art, it's a civic duty. In Sumer, beer wasn't just for temple ceremonies or casual drinking. It was baked directly into law. Yes, actual clay tablets from around 2100 BCE detail regulations on beer quality, price, and even punishment for tavern fraud. You see a corner stall, a kind of proto-bar, run by a middle-aged woman with strong arms and a sharp gaze. She's pouring out equal measures into measuring cups carved from river shell, keeping track on a knotted string at her waist. 1 measure for a soldier, 2 for a scribe who just got paid. And right there on the wall, a list of prices etched into a board. Beer, fish stew, barley cakes. Everything's tracked, because the moment someone starts selling drink for profit, the city's eyes, and taxes, get involved. The Code of Urukagina and later the Code of Hammurabi, while from slightly different Mesopotamian periods, both touch on tavern laws. One infamous line from Hammurabi's code, admittedly more Babylonian than Sumerian, threatens death by drowning for women who serve conspirators in taverns. Cheerful stuff, though scholars still argue whether such laws were literal or symbolic deterrents. But here's the curious bit, many of these tavern keepers were women. Some historians believe they doubled as informants for the state, gathering whispers from inebriated patrons and passing them along. Others suspect they were simply savvy entrepreneurs in a beer-based economy. Either way, you'd better not skip out on your tab. You step into the stall and sit on a reed mat. The owner offers you a shallow clay bowl of beer, not a cup. The beer is thick, porridge-like. It's more meal than drink. You sip cautiously. It tastes earthy, faintly sour, and a bit smoky. Probably some toasted grain. She grins and offers you a straw, long, hollow, and made of golden reed. And now, finally, you understand why. This beer is unfiltered. Bits of barley and husk float lazily near the surface. If you tried to drink from the bowl directly, you'd get a mouthful of mush. The straw, narrow and gently ridged, lets you bypass the floating solids and access the fermented liquid below. A design born of necessity, not elegance. Some wealthier patrons used metal-tipped straws, even silver ones. A set of ornate straws was found in a Sumerian royal tomb, possibly the earliest known drinking straws in human history. You imagine a courtier sipping beer with royal flair, pinky raised, pretending not to gag on the barley chunks. A small group gathers beside you. Workers mostly, farmhands, dock loaders, basket weavers. They're trading news about water levels, livestock prices, and who saw which god in their dreams last week. One man insists Enki visited him and demanded he build a new granary. Another claims his dream involved more dancing goats than divine instruction. Either way, the beer helps the story flow. A fly lands on your cheek. You shoo it away slowly, too relaxed to bother with real anger. Another lands on the rim of your bowl and takes a dainty sip. You let it. It's earned it. What's remarkable is that this grainy, gurgling drink kept an entire civilization running. Beer wasn't a side note, it was a cornerstone. Workers building ziggurats were often paid in beer rations. One record from the city of Umma lists beer allotments for different labor classes. Standard workers got about 2 liters a day. High-status officials? More than 5. And children drank it, too. Don't raise your eyebrows. This wasn't today's IPA. Sumerian beer was much lower in alcohol and full of nutrients, practically a vitamin supplement. Think of it as barley soup that makes your knees a bit looser. Of course, not every batch was equal. You hear a complaint from one drinker, last week's was better. The tavern keeper shrugs. The mash didn't sing this time. A poetic way of saying the fermentation flopped. Sometimes, the yeast didn't behave. Sometimes, the goddess Ninkasi was simply in a mood. One nearby customer swears by a brewer upriver who adds crushed dates and honey. You consider investigating later. Or never. You're not sure you're moving again tonight. Historians still debate how consistent Sumerian brewing techniques really were. Some tablets suggest meticulous ratios and procedures, others seem more like vague poems. It's possible that every household had its own tweaks, its own secrets. Much like sourdough starters today, each brew might have carried a bit of home, a bit of luck, a bit of wild yeast from someone's elbow. You lean back against the mud brick wall. It's warm from the day's sun. Your bowl rests on your knee, straw gently bobbing. Across the street, a harpist begins a slow tune, a lullaby for grown-ups who drank just enough. You close your eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to listen. To the quiet slurp of straws, the occasional burp of contentment, the rustle of papyrus paper as someone scribbles another receipt. These are the sounds of Sumer winding down. The woman beside you mutters something about tomorrow's barley prices, then offers you a second bowl. You politely decline. Not because you're done, but because your mind is beginning to float, like the husks on the surface of the brew. You stretch your legs. Someone laughs softly at a joke about a donkey falling into a beer vat. You're too drowsy to ask for the punchline. Somewhere, in another part of the city, a high priest is also sipping beer. But his is likely chilled, seasoned, and served from a cup made of lapis lazuli. A different world entirely, but the same drink. That's the magic of it. No matter where you stood in Sumerian society, fieldworker or king, priestess or apprentice, you drank from the same brewing tradition. It connected the sacred and the mundane, the ancient and the ordinary. And, if you had a straw, it tasted just a little better. A breeze stirs the thatch above your head. It's gentle, but it carries the scent of something familiar now, fermenting grain, sun-baked earth, and wet clay. You stand slowly, brushing off crumbs of dried barley mash from your robe, and begin to wander once again, this time toward the quiet banks of the canal. The moonlight glistens on the water's surface, and a few frogs croak half-heartedly, already drifting off themselves. As you approach a small family compound on the city's edge, the air grows thick with another layer of life, the sounds of evening brewing rituals. You pause at the entrance. Inside, under the glow of oil lamps, a woman and her 2 daughters are singing softly as they stir a bubbling vat. You recognize the tune. It's the hymn to Ninkasi. Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. She of froth and ferment, of bubble and bloat. The one who brings joy to the heart and fog to the mind. Her hymn, inscribed in cuneiform around 1800 BCE but likely much older, doubles as a kind of recipe, a praise poem that also reminds you not to burn the mash. Born of the flowing water, the eldest daughter sings, you bake the bread with care and prepare the sweet wort. The lines are lyrical, but they're also instructional. Bake the bapper, the twice-baked barley bread, mix it with dates and honey, add water, stir and sing, stir and sing. Some scholars argue the hymn was never meant as a technical manual. Too flowery, too vague. Others think it served as an oral guide, meant to be memorized by brewers who couldn't read. After all, literacy was rare. But beer? Beer was for everyone. You're handed a small morsel of vapor. It's dry, dense, slightly sweet. This is what gets dissolved into the mash. You chew thoughtfully. It's surprisingly chewy. If it had raisins, it might pass for a modern granola bar. Another piece is tossed into the bubbling vat, steam rising in lazy curls. The brewing process here is quiet, methodical. Barley is soaked and sprouted, just long enough to awaken the sugars inside. Then it's dried and pounded, baked into cakes, and broken again. Everything is recycled, repurposed. Waste not, want not, especially in a society where every kernel of grain was counted by a scribe with a stylus and a tablet. You notice a little boy tiptoeing around the brewing pot, trying to sneak a sip. The mother catches him and shoos him off with a gentle swat. But you can tell she's amused. Everyone in the house helps with brewing, even the toddlers, especially the toddlers, who are excellent at stirring without questioning why. As the mixture begins to thicken, the aroma intensifies. It's toasty, nutty, with a sour undertone that makes your nose twitch. They're getting close to the fermentation stage. In Sumer, fermentation wasn't a science, it was a ritual. No thermometers, no hydrometers, just intuition and the grace of Ninkasi. The yeast? Likely wild. Carried in from the air, the grain, even the brewer's hands. You watch as they transfer the warm mash to large clay jars, each sealed with linen and left under a woven canopy to cool. Some of these jars are inscribed with seals, identifying the family or the household responsible. Others are plain, communal, shared among neighbors or traded for spices and fish. One of the daughters shows you how they stack the jars near the door to catch the morning breeze. She explains, between yawns, that they'll wait 3 days before tasting. But sometimes, she adds, Ninkasi is impatient. Sometimes, it bubbles sooner. You find yourself wondering how often fermentation failed. Surely, a sour batch or spoiled mash must have happened. Historians still argue whether the Sumerians fully understood what yeast was, or whether they just learned by accident. Some even believe brewers reused sediment from the bottom of old jars, a kind of primitive starter culture, unknowingly preserving the wild yeast strains that worked best. You look around. There's no measuring cup, no timer, no written checklist. But there is rhythm, generations of it. The brew cycle is tied to the moon, to the temperature, to the flow of water and grain. It's as natural as sleeping or storytelling. Someone behind you burps quietly. You don't turn. It feels like part of the music. Suddenly, the matriarch claps her hands and announces that the last of the brew is resting. She thanks Ninkasi with a quick prayer and begins to rinse her hands with a jug of cool water. Her daughters slump against the wall. One of them is already half asleep, her head lolling onto a sack of barley. The night has grown cooler. You wrap your shawl tighter around your shoulders. A faint mist rises from the canal as frogs resume their sleepy chorus. You offer a final nod to the family and step away from the compound, your path lit by tiny flickers of lamplight reflecting in puddles left from the day's irrigation. Everywhere you go, beer is quietly present. In temples and homes, at work sites and festivals. It connects fields to households, scribes to soldiers, women to deities. It's not intoxicating. Not yet. But it hums in the background like a lullaby, soothing and ever-present. You find yourself humming part of the Ninkasi hymn, surprised at how quickly you've picked it up. You are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. Dramatic praise, perhaps, but when you sip it by the river, with the moon watching, it almost feels accurate. A small breeze rustles the reeds. You spot a fisherman asleep in his canoe, his line forgotten in the water. A gurgle rises from a nearby brewing jar. Somewhere, fermentation begins. And with it, tomorrow's dreams. You walk slowly now, your sandals tracing soft half-circles in the dusty earth as you head toward one of the city's communal beer houses, if you could call it that. It's more of a shaded courtyard behind a humble clay brick building, its low walls etched with faint carvings of barley stalks and wavy lines that might be water or just decorative squiggles. Either way, it's clear this is where people gather when the day is too hot, and the beer too fresh to resist. There's no door, just a thick hanging reed mat that you gently push aside. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of fermentation, sweat, and laughter. It's dim but not unfriendly. A few oil lamps flicker along the walls, their flames soft and irregular, as though half asleep themselves. Men and women sit cross-legged on woven mats, each with a large clay vessel in front of them. Some of the pots are almost as tall as their torsos. Everyone is sipping slowly, through straws. And not just any straws, long, elegant, and made of either gold, copper, or hollow reeds. Some are plain, others are ornately decorated with little curls or stamped symbols. You crouch next to a group and peer into one of the pots. The beer is thick, muddy, almost porridge-like, and flecked with little floating bits of grain. It looks more like breakfast than a beverage. That's the point, though. Sumerian beer isn't filtered. It's chunky. The straw serves two purposes: to reach the liquid nestled below the floating sediment, and to prevent you from chewing your way through your drink. Scholars still debate whether every household had access to metal straws, or if those were reserved for temple elites and dignitaries. Most likely, everyday drinkers used reeds, which grew abundantly near the marshlands. You're offered a seat and a communal pot. The host gestures to the surface, where a single long reed straw stands upright like a lazy flagpole. You lean forward, sip gently, and are immediately hit with a sour, slightly sweet flavor, much like fermented apples mixed with bread and river water. Not bad. Definitely beer. A man next to you toasts something indistinct, perhaps the gods, perhaps the irrigation god specifically, or perhaps just the fact that it's nearly bedtime. You toast back without knowing the words. The beer here is slightly fizzy, probably thanks to natural carbonation from wild fermentation. It's also low in alcohol by modern standards. This isn't a party drink. It's hydration. Nutrition. A liquid meal, complete with calories, trace vitamins, and the mild buzz of not needing to chew. Some Sumeriologists theorize that the use of straws may also have been ceremonial. A way to elevate the act of drinking into something more deliberate, more refined. Others suggest that these long implements, especially the golden ones found in tombs, may have had a social signaling function. A golden straw across your lap meant you were someone. A well-connected priestess. A temple accountant. Maybe just someone with good connections and a lot of barley to spare. You notice a child slurping from their own mini jar with a stubby straw. It's adorable and vaguely futuristic, like some baby version of a space-age hydration system. The child's face is serious. Focused. He's clearly taking his role as a Sumerian beer connoisseur very seriously. As the evening stretches on, a traveling singer enters the courtyard and begins a low, rhythmic chant. It's about the goddess Ninhursag and a tale involving a frog who tried to steal a farmer's grain storage. The details are hazy, possibly due to regional dialects, or possibly due to your growing sleepiness, but the crowd finds it gently hilarious. Someone passes you a date cake. Sticky, warm, and fragrant. It pairs strangely well with the beer. You make a mental note to try this combination again, if you ever find yourself back in 2400 BCE. Across the room, a woman is carefully inspecting a set of reeds, measuring their diameter, testing the bend. She's preparing a new straw for tomorrow's brew. Apparently, not all reeds are created equal. Some clog, some crack. Others, if cut just right, make a pleasant whistling sound as you sip, a built-in beer flute. You chuckle softly. Historians still argue whether beer was sipped exclusively with straws or if that practice was specific to communal drinking. Some temples had specialized brewing facilities with built-in straw holes in the jars. Others show individual cups. It's entirely possible that both methods existed simultaneously, dictated by social class, occasion, or just personal preference. Like forks and chopsticks, one doesn't necessarily replace the other. A dog curls up at your feet. You don't know whose it is, but it seems perfectly at ease, its belly rising and falling with every slow breath. You stroke its fur absent-mindedly and feel a ripple of calm spread up your arm. The singer finishes his song and bows low. The crowd claps politely, more rustling than noise, and someone tosses him a bundle of dried fish as payment. He nods appreciatively and retreats back into the night. Your pot is nearly empty. The straw makes a gurgling sound as it searches for the last sips beneath the sediment. Someone leans over and gently replaces your straw with a fresh one. You nod your thanks and settle in again, feeling the soft weight of beer, bread, and moonlight pulling you downward. Nearby, someone starts humming the Ninkasi hymn again, slower this time. Almost a lullaby. Another adds a harmony. A third joins in with a gentle tap on an overturned bowl, creating a beat just soft enough to feel in your ribs. The communal courtyard begins to breathe together, everyone swaying ever so slightly with the rhythm. A voice whispers something unintelligible in your ear, perhaps a dream, perhaps a toast. You don't need to answer. Because here, under the stars, sipping through a hollow reed into a half-liquid dream, you understand something older than writing, the simple peace of drinking beer with strangers who feel like friends. You're back on your feet now, gently swaying with the rhythm of digestion and a pleasantly mellow beer buzz. The streets of the city, you are, most likely, though the exact signage has long been worn away, are quieter now, lit by occasional torches and the ambient glow of clay oil lamps perched on stoops. You follow a little winding alley, its walls warm with the day's heat, and arrive at a low building with a curious scent wafting through its doorway, a mix of roasted barley, boiled dates, and something faintly metallic. Inside, you're greeted by the unmistakable sounds of brewing in progress. Bubbling pots, scraping ladles, the occasional muffled grunt of exertion. This is a Sumerian brewing hut, half kitchen, half temple lab. A woman in a long linen tunic glances up from her work and gives you a nod. She's stirring something thick and brown in a massive clay vat that could easily double as a bathtub. Steam rises around her like a veil. Sumerian brewers were often women, usually affiliated with temples or noble households. Some historians even argue they were considered priestesses of Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Her name was more than symbolic. She had her own hymn, her own rituals, and her own detailed brewing instructions that read like a divine recipe card. You settle on a bench as the brewer begins her next task. She opens a large sack of bapper, half-baked barley bread that forms the backbone of Sumerian beer. It's dry, lumpy, and a little scorched on the edges, like the sad leftovers of a bakery fire. She crumbles it expertly into the pot, letting it dissolve into the warm water like ancient soup crackers. The smell changes immediately, richer, deeper, slightly tangy. You lean forward and peer into the vat. It's a murky affair, the consistency of loose oatmeal, dotted with date pulp and bits of barley husk. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but you're reminded that brewing here isn't about appearances, it's about nutrition, calories, divine favor, and maybe a little communal bonding over who accidentally scorched their batch. A younger assistant enters the room carrying a woven basket of dried emmer wheat, another common grain used in the process. He trips slightly over the threshold, just a wobble, but a cloud of grain escapes into the air like shimmering fairy dust. Everyone chuckles quietly. Brewing, like everything else in ancient Sumer, required patience and a certain level of shrugging acceptance when things went a bit sideways. The assistant begins to add the emmer, hand by handful, murmuring a little chant as he does. You recognize a few words, Ninkasi, sweet water, and what might be, let the yeast be kind. Whether it's prayer, poetry, or just rhythmic habit, it sets a peaceful tone. There's no thermometers here, of course, and no digital timers. The brewer checks temperature with the back of her hand, reading the vat like a seasoned grandmother testing a baby's bath. When it reaches the right warmth, neither boiling nor cold, she sprinkles in a mysterious grayish powder. Yeast? Probably. Though historians still argue whether Sumerians understood fermentation as a process or simply treated it as a magical gift from the gods. Given how often things went wrong or right with no clear explanation, a little divine credit probably helped morale. You're invited to try your hand at stirring. The paddle is heavier than it looks, carved from date palm wood and worn smooth by decades of use. As you stir, you notice how the mixture clings to the paddle and shifts like slow lava. The brewer corrects your angle gently, guiding your hands in a more efficient arc. You nod like an eager apprentice. She's seen dozens like you, fresh-faced, curious, mildly in the way. One wall of the room is lined with fermentation jars. Tall, lidded, and sealed with thick clay plugs. Each is marked with a symbol, some geometric, some animal-like. Likely indicating date brewed, household owner, or whether it's a ceremonial or everyday batch. One jar has a crudely drawn cat on it. Whether that means it's for temple feasts or just that a cat fell into the mix once, no one's quite sure. You learn that fermentation takes a few days, depending on temperature and grain quality. Some brews turn out slightly sweet, others more sour. A few go off entirely, becoming strange vinegary concoctions best left for cleaning tools or, as one joke goes, treating foot infections. There's an open debate among scholars over whether failed beer was discarded or repurposed into sauces, livestock feed, or very brave medicinal tonics. Someone enters the hut with a bundle of reeds, new straws in the making. They're cut to different lengths, sorted by thickness, and bundled with twine. Each one will be tested in water later, to check for cracks or mold. The brewing operation isn't just barley and dates, it's craftsmanship at every stage. Even the straws have standards. A small clay tablet leans against one shelf. It's engraved with cuneiform script so fine you have to squint. The brewer sees you looking and chuckles. It's not a recipe, she says, but a delivery note, 20 jars to be sent to a local festival, 24 loaves of bapper, and one scolding line about last month's batch being too cloudy for the gods. You smile. Quality control, it seems, is eternal. As the brewer covers the vat and stokes the hearth beneath it, you feel a strange kinship with this whole process. Beer is food, yes, but it's also ritual, insurance against famine, and a kind of warm, edible lullaby handed down from gods to grandmothers. You step outside and let the cool air hit your face. The stars are out now, tiny pricks of silver light, scattered like millet across a black stone bowl. Somewhere in the distance, you hear a slow drum beat and the faint hum of another courtyard's Ninkasi song drifting across rooftops. Behind you, the brewer hums a line from that same hymn, soft, steady, and slightly off-key. And you realize, this isn't just beer. It's the rhythm of a civilization. You take a quiet stroll through the darker edge of the residential quarter, now gently buzzing with post-dinner calm. Fires burn low in hearths, casting golden light through narrow slits in mud brick walls. Somewhere, a baby cries and is quickly soothed with an age-old lullaby. You pass a family gathering around what appears to be a low platform table, sharing flatbread, lentil stew, and of course, a communal jar of freshly brewed beer. This right here, is where your focus shifts tonight. You're going to follow the life of one very important piece of Sumerian dinnerware, the beer straw. It doesn't look like much at first glance, just a hollow reed, perhaps a bit of carved wood or even a clay tube, about 1.5 feet long. But that unassuming utensil is, in a sense, your passport to Sumerian beer culture. Without it, you'd be nose-deep in sludge. Literally. You sit beside a clay jar at one family's evening gathering. The father offers you a seat with a nod, and the eldest daughter, barely into her teens, passes you one of the polished straws. She has a slight smirk on her face, like she knows you're a newcomer. You place the straw in the jar's small opening and give it a tentative sip. The taste hits first, earthy, slightly sour, a bit chewy even. This is no modern lager. You're essentially sipping a hybrid between porridge and potion. But it's oddly comforting, like something your great-grandmother might brew on a stormy day. The straw filters out the floating bits of barley hulls, date fragments, and yeast clusters. Without it, you'd spend half your time spitting debris into a napkin that doesn't exist yet. Historians still argue whether Sumerian straws were purely practical or held ceremonial significance as well. Some were ornately carved and inlaid with shell or silver, likely used in elite or temple settings. Others were disposable, simple reeds plucked from the marshes. There's even archaeological evidence of multi-user beer jars with several straws arranged like the world's oldest drinking game. You try to picture it, a circle of priests, heads bent low, each sipping through their own bendy-looking reed, murmuring prayers between gulps and trying not to slurp too loudly in front of Ninkasi's statue. Across the dinner circle, the youngest child tries to sip without using the straw. He leans over the rim and gets a mouthful of grainy foam. The whole family erupts in gentle laughter. Even 4,000 years ago, kids were still testing boundaries and getting frothy mustaches for their trouble. The father gestures for you to try a second straw, this one thinner, longer, with small holes carved at the bottom end. A sort of ancient filter design. You give it a go, and immediately the brew feels smoother. You're starting to understand the difference between a novice's straw and a seasoned beer connoisseur's tool. It's like choosing between a sippy cup and a fancy pour-over. One woman at the gathering notices your interest and disappears into the back room. When she returns, she holds out something remarkable, a metal straw, copper or bronze, darkened with age but unmistakably crafted. It's an heirloom, she explains through gestures and a few muttered syllables. Passed down through generations. Probably not used often, maybe just for solstice feasts or funerals of particularly beloved elders. There's something oddly touching about a civilization that held its beer tools in such high esteem. You watch how everyone in the family has a slightly different sipping rhythm. The mother pauses between pulls, eyes half closed in thought. The older son takes long, practiced drafts like he's racing against time. Even the family dog, a dusty, long-legged creature curled at the mat's edge, snoozes in time with the household's calm, slurping tempo. When the meal winds down, the straws are rinsed in a communal basin. No plastic waste, no landfill. Just clean reeds and water. Some are saved for tomorrow, others tossed into the hearth to dry and crackle into nothing. One of the daughters lays hers on the windowsill to dry. It has a delicate curve and a notch at the top, probably a homemade addition to avoid tongue splinters. As you leave the household with a grateful nod, you realize how integral this tool was, not just for drinking, but for social rituals, household bonding, and subtle etiquette. In a way, straws were status symbols. The more ornate the straw, the higher your seat at the table. If someone handed you a gold-tipped one, you were either royalty, or about to be sacrificed in style. The night air is cooler now, and you wander down toward the riverbank. Near a marshy inlet, two young boys are cutting new reeds, their feet squelching into the mud as frogs chirp nearby. They debate which reeds are best, thick, straight, hollow all the way through. The younger one insists the curved ones make the beer feel happier. His older brother disagrees, arguing that straight reeds carry more flavor. The scholarly debate continues well past your hearing range. As you sit on a rock and gaze at the stars reflected in the river's gentle current, you marvel at how one tiny object, a straw, could connect so many people across time. From temple brewers to village families to mischievous kids at the riverside, the humble beer straw tells a story of need, invention, and just a little elegance in the middle of muddy everyday life. So next time you sip something cold through a straw, plastic or paper or steel, spare a sleepy thought for the Sumerians. They did it first. And arguably, they did it better. Your walk takes you back through the quieter streets of the city, where late-night temple chants echo faintly from the Ziggurat steps. The moon hangs low, a pale disk reflected in every puddle left by the irrigation channels. You follow the rhythmic splashes of your own sandals along a narrow canal where brewery workers once hauled water by the jugful. Tonight, your journey turns toward the architects of flavor, the brewers themselves. The Sumerians didn't have hops, carbonation, or even a clear division between beer and bread. What they did have were genius women, patient fermentation, and a loose understanding of microbial magic. Yes, women. It might surprise you, but for centuries, brewing beer in Sumer was the domain of women, particularly priestesses or household heads. If you were a goddess-worshipping, barley-sorting woman in Uruk, chances are you were also the family brewer. Not a bad resume, really. You duck beneath a woven awning and step into the low-lit confines of a household brewery. The smell hits you first, grainy sweetness, warm steam, something almost like sourdough left to prove for too long. There's an unmistakable hum in the air, not from bees, but from bubbling fermentation jars. A middle-aged woman named Shibtu, you think, that's what it sounded like, beckons you closer. She wears a flour-dusted robe, and her hands are stained dark with barley. She doesn't speak much, but she gestures clearly. This vat, she indicates, is the first step, soaking barley grains in water until they begin to sprout. Malting. You nod, impressed. You weren't expecting this level of science so early in history. The Sumerians may not have known about enzymes or sugars on a molecular level, but they knew what worked. And they wrote songs to the goddess Ninkasi to help remember each step, in case a generation forgot the recipe. Historians still argue whether these beer brewing songs were instructional hymns, religious rituals, or early forms of industrial documentation. The truth is, they were probably all three. Multi-purpose chants, sung as your feet crushed malt into the clay floor, the rhythm keeping time with your stirring. Shibtu pulls open a woven lid to show you the next step, a bubbling mass of soggy bread paste. This was bapper, a sort of hard barley biscuit baked ahead of time and then soaked to break down the starches. It looks like if granola and a sea sponge had an ill-fated baby. But to the Sumerians, it was golden. She hands you a chunk. You bite it. It's dry, chewy, sweetened with dates and flavored with herbs. You could see this being a trail snack for a long ox cart ride. But here, it's destined to dissolve into the beer mix, bringing flavor and fermentable sugars. She stirs the slurry with a long, paddle-shaped reed. There's no thermometer, no pH strip, just intuition and years of quiet observation. If a batch goes bad, you try again. If the foam rises too fast, you chant louder. She motions you to a back room where the jars are kept. Massive ceramic vessels line the walls, sealed with reeds and wax. One is unsealed, and the smell coming off it is both appealing and deeply odd. Like sour apples and rain-soaked bread. Fermentation at work. Bacteria and wild yeast are doing their thing, without microscopes, without sterilization. It's the most natural chemistry you've ever seen. There's a dog asleep in the corner. Not guarding anything. Just napping, like he knows that in this house, the beer is safe. At the far wall, a small shrine to Ninkasi watches over the process. A carved clay plaque with her name etched above a cup-shaped offering bowl. Someone has placed a sprig of mint in it. Whether for flavor or devotion, you can't tell. You take a seat on a low stool. Shibtu offers you a cup of the fresh stuff, still warm, still frothy. You sip. It's cloudy, barely liquid, but carries that deep barley richness that's oddly comforting. No carbonation, no crisp finish. Just grain, time, and reverence. In truth, this beer wasn't just a beverage, it was nutrition. It was safer than most water, packed with calories, and gentle enough to give children. It filled bellies when food ran scarce, and it forged bonds between strangers. Think of it less as party fuel and more like drinkable bread. Outside, the night air grows cooler, and the stars multiply. You can still hear faint laughter from neighboring homes. Someone drops a pot, another person shouts something about spilled millet. You imagine the dozens of similar breweries working across the city, each one led by a woman like Shibtu. Each with her own variations, more dates, fewer herbs, different fermentation times. No two beers alike, yet all instantly familiar. And it wasn't just women brewing at home. Temples had their own large-scale operations. State-run breweries churned out offerings for festivals, pay for laborers, and even rations for prisoners. Some records from temple archives list beer by the quart, divided by age, rank, or profession. Priests got the good stuff. Builders got the hearty sludge. Children got a thin, low-alcohol version served with mashed lentils. You lean back and look up at the dark, woven ceiling above you, watching the flickering shadows of the oil lamp. There's a tranquility here, a simplicity to the rhythm of barley, water, and time. No slogans. No logos. Just a brew and a goddess. As you prepare to leave, Shibtu hands you a small gift, a dried bapper biscuit wrapped in reed. She pats your hand with the weary kindness of someone who's seen generations come and go, and taught all of them how to brew. Outside, the canal glows in the moonlight. The brewery's door closes behind you with a soft creak. The street is silent but for the gentle lapping of water against worn clay banks. You walk slowly, clutching your barley biscuit and wondering how many civilizations owe their survival to yeast and women who knew when to stir. You pass by the outer walls of a granary now, its mud brick side still faintly warm from the day's sun. Somewhere behind it, oxen rustle in the hay, and someone coughs gently in their sleep. It's a quiet hour, but for the Sumerians, this quiet masked a bustling economy that revolved around more than gold or gems. It revolved around grain, and by extension, beer. Tonight, your next steps take you into the ancient, humming heart of logistics, Sumerian grain accounting. It may sound like a sleep aid in itself, and to be fair, it kind of is, but behind every frothy cup of barley beer was a bureaucratic empire of clay tablets, rope-bound tallies, and a dizzying array of barley categories. You enter a low, windowless hall where the scribes worked, rows of reed mats, wooden shelves, and tablets stacked like loaves of bread. A young scribe named Enlil glances up from a slab of damp clay. He looks to be about 17 and already has ink-stained fingernails and a 1,000-yard stare. In his lap is a stylus carved from a river reed, sharpened to a wedge at one end. He doesn't talk much, but he grunts with something like amusement as you enter. On his tablet, a beer ration chart. He points at symbols you can barely decipher, a pictogram of a head, a person, 3 vertical strokes, the number 3, a tilted jug, beer, and a wedge-shaped tally, a day. It's a delivery list, 3 measures of beer, daily, for a temple musician. Below that, 2 measures for a bricklayer. Half a measure for a child. Each one a line in a tightly managed ecosystem. You squat beside him as he adds a fresh line, an extra measure allocated to the temple gardener for completing a barley harvest ahead of schedule. Promotion via pint. Historians still argue whether these tallies were ceremonial, bureaucratic, or both. Some think the beer distribution system doubled as a way to keep loyalty within the working classes. Everyone from slaves to supervisors got paid in bread and beer. Others think it reflected a deeply spiritual economy, one in which every barley kernel had to be accounted for, lest the gods grow irritated. You reach toward a shelf, and Enlil waves you away. Those tablets are still drying. They'll be baked tomorrow and stored in a kiln-warmed archive where tax auditors and temple treasurers can reference them. Yes, tax auditors. The Sumerians had a form of taxation, and beer rations were a taxable commodity. If your farm underproduced, your beer allotment might shrink. If your temple had a surplus, it might be redistributed to the poor, or, let's be honest, to bureaucrats' cousins. It's not just barley and laborers, though. Some tablets describe specialty batches, beer brewed with date syrup for priests, a sour brew made specifically for funerals, and something called dark beer, which no one can quite describe but which probably tasted like liquid roasted bread. The Sumerians had at least 20 different words for beer. Each had a different strength, purpose, or method of brewing. Some were for daily use, others for sacrifices, and one may have simply been reserved for the goddess Ninkasi herself. It's as though their language wrapped itself around the drink, coiling into subtleties we can barely decode now. Outside the hall, you notice a few clay tablets stacked carelessly by a doorway, ready to be recycled. Once the contents of a tablet were no longer needed, they could be soaked in water and reshaped, history becoming pliable again. You take a moment to sit on a reed mat and imagine being a scribe in a world where barley was as powerful as currency. You picture yourself counting sacks of grain arriving from the canals, adjusting records to reflect a minor flood that ruined part of the harvest. Maybe you'd fudge a few numbers to help a friend get an extra jug. Even now, the smell of old clay and barley gruel clings to your robe. There's a dusty comfort to it. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, not quite time for sunrise, but a false alarm from one of the more enthusiastic birds. You stand, stretch your back, and peek into the adjoining room. A storeroom for raw barley. Floor to ceiling, sack after sack. The smell is dense, nutty, slightly damp. You run your fingers through a few kernels. Golden. perfect for both bread and beer. Some have already begun to sprout, a sure sign they'll be used soon. A small boy scampers in to grab a scoop, his arms barely big enough to wrap around the bowl. He vanishes again through a reed curtain, probably to deliver the grain to a household brewery just like Shibtu's. In the background, a long, slow chant rises. A prayer? A tallying song? You can't quite tell. But it's got a rhythm to it, like someone is marking time with each word. You leave the scribe's quarters behind and walk out into the pre-dawn dark. The scent of night jasmine drifts from a nearby garden. A few dogs lope past you, half-heartedly barking at a cat who clearly doesn't care. You wonder how many generations sat wherein Lil Shuma now sits, carving out daily beer counts in the dim light. How many of those tablets still lie under the sands, unread for 4,000 years? And you wonder, what would it have been like to wake every morning knowing your work would determine someone else's dinner, their drink, their sense of peace? Perhaps you'd find comfort in the predictability of it all. Barley in. Records made. Beer out. Sleep. Repeat. You pass a reed basket on a stoop, filled with used styluses, some broken, others just worn flat. Someone was busy today. You keep walking. Your feet trace the ancient lines of a city that brewed not just beer, but bureaucracy. And in some small way, it's oddly soothing, this web of clay and grain and memory. You follow the scent of roasted grain and wet earth until it leads you to a quieter quarter of the city, still within the sacred ring, but further from the scribes and closer to where beer began its true life, in the soaking pits and malting slabs of the brewer's courtyard. D. Here, the air is rich and heavy with fermentation, an unmistakable blend of barley mash, yeasty breath, and sun-warmed mud. You pass under an awning made from woven palm fronds and step into a wide, open space surrounded by low walls. Rows of flat, sun-baked bricks make up the floor, and at regular intervals, shallow basins have been carved directly into the earth. Some are filled with sprouted barley drying in the moonlight, others with thick porridge-like mash slowly bubbling in the warmth of the evening. A brewer named Botsy gives you a curt nod. She's older, with deep-set eyes and hands like driftwood, strong, scarred, and stained dark by years of lifting wet grain. She's been working since dusk, keeping vigil over her batches, stirring them occasionally with a paddle carved from fig wood. As you watch, she flicks a handful of sprouted barley into a large pot already filled with hot water and date syrup. The scent that rises is syrupy, smoky, and slightly sour, like overripe fruit baking in the sun. First boil, she mutters, mostly to herself. This is where things get serious. The barley has already been soaked, sprouted, and partially dried. Now it will be boiled into a wort, the sweet, thick soup that will ferment into beer. Not with hops, Sumerians didn't use them, but through a natural process driven by wild yeasts clinging to the grain and the tools themselves. Tools that rarely, if ever, got fully washed. Each had its own microbial personality. Historians still argue whether the Sumerians truly understood fermentation or simply revered it as divine magic. Some believe they thought the bubbling was the breath of a goddess, others think they knew more than we give them credit for, at least enough to control it. You crouch beside a vat and dip a ladle into the warm, viscous liquid. It tastes like sweet barley pudding with a whisper of rot. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Like something half-remembered from another lifetime. Botsy shrugs. It'll get stronger. Around the courtyard, other brewers go about their work. A young woman strains mash through a reed mat, pressing it flat with her bare feet. Nearby, a teenage boy adds fermented dough into a jar, an old trick to kickstart a sluggish batch. These techniques, passed through generations, aren't written down. They live in bodies and gestures, in muscle memory and shared meals. You notice a jar sealed with beeswax tucked into a corner, marked with a black stripe. Ceremonial, Botsy explains. Meant for the temple feast next week. Stronger, spicier. We added tamarisk ash and goat milk. That one, you decide, you'll leave to the gods. In the far corner of the courtyard stands a straw-lined barrel with reeds sticking out like porcupine quills. A communal jug, this one fermenting openly for the neighborhood to dip from throughout the night. You watch as an old man with a crooked spine shuffles up, selects a clean reed straw, and sips deeply. He sighs through his nose, wipes his beard, and shuffles away. Straws were necessary, not just custom. Sumerian beer was often thick, unfiltered, and full of floating bits, grain hulls, sediment, and wild yeast. Drinking it without a straw would be like slurping soup filled with gravel. Reeds worked well, filtering the drink on its way to the tongue. In wealthier homes, these straws were made of metal and ornately decorated. But most were humble, hollow plant stems, used once, maybe twice, then tossed. And while you sip from one yourself, cool, nutty, surprisingly fizzy, you realize that this wasn't just a beverage. It was food. It had calories, nutrition, and purpose. Beer wasn't an indulgence, it was daily sustenance, safer than water, richer than porridge. Botsy offers you a small clay bowl filled with mash, what remains after the liquid's been drained. We feed this to pigs, or sometimes mix it into bread, she says. You nibble. It's chewy, a little tart, with the same earthy backbone as the beer. You nod. It makes sense. Waste nothing. A dog pads into the courtyard and lays near a warm vat. No one shoos it away. This is a place of community as much as craft. Children nap near fermentation pots. A few neighbors pass in and out with their own jars, laughing softly, gossiping under their breath. Someone brings out a reed flute. It plays a low, spiraling melody as the night deepens. As you relax near one of the stone basins, you think about how something so mundane, wet grain, rotting just right, became central to an entire civilization. And how, despite being thousands of years old, the rhythms here feel familiar. Soaking, boiling, stirring, waiting. The same patience as bread, the same care as tea, the same reward as sleep. You lean back against a warm wall. A frog chirps. Somewhere in the distance, a camel snorts in its sleep. The stars are unusually clear, and the sky looks almost content. And there you are, part of a process older than empire, older than empires yet to come. Watching steam rise from a barley vat and thinking, maybe for the first time in your life, that fermentation might just be the world's most peaceful miracle. The embers of the night burn low, and the courtyard is quieter now. Botsy leans against a clay jar, sipping from a reed, eyes half-lidded. You stay near the warm vats, their surfaces still faintly bubbling like thick porridge in a dream. But Botsy beckons you gently, motioning with a curl of her fingers. Come see the old tools, she says. You follow her through a narrow passage behind the brewery. Here, away from the heat of boiling mash and the tang of fermenting barley, lies a low-roofed storage room with shelves made of palm wood. The place smells of dust, dry reeds, and ancient effort. Clay pots line the walls, each with a loop of twine tied around the neck, a few with tags inscribed in cuneiform, labels only scribes and brewers understand. She sets a few items on the ground, a wide, shallow bowl, a wooden mallet with a handle worn smooth, and a split reed straw whose ends are bound with string. These, she says, were passed down from her grandmother, who learned from hers, and so on, back as far as anyone remembers. Not museum pieces, real tools that once helped birth beer for workers, priests, and even kings. You run your fingers along the mallet's edge. The dents speak of thousands of strikes, cracking soaked grain open just enough, not too much. Next, the straw, one end tapered, the other fitted with a faintly charred clay filter. For strong brews, Botsy murmurs. The kind too thick to sip clean. In Sumerian homes, every family owned at least one reed straw. But higher status households used special metal-tipped ones, passed between guests like sacred objects. Some archaeologists argue whether this early drinking etiquette was a sign of status sharing or mere practicality. Perhaps it was both. There's an old Sumerian proverb, Botsi says, that goes something like, "He who shares his straw, keeps no secrets." A laugh escapes you. That might explain a lot of ancient diplomacy. On a high shelf, you spot a clay tablet etched with what looks like a recipe. Botsi explains it's one of the oldest known beer formulas. The ingredients? Barley, water, and something called vapor. You tilt your head. Vapor? Ah yes, here we go. Vapor wasn't just a fun word to say. It was the heart of the Sumerian brewing method. Not quite bread, not quite grain, vapor was a twice-baked barley cake, dry, hard, and packed with flavor. Made with barley flour, water, honey or date syrup, and sometimes spices, it was baked until rock-hard, then stored for months. When the time came, it was broken into pieces and soaked in water to begin the brewing process. Imagine if your morning coffee started with smashing a biscotti into a pot. That's vapor. It served as a stable, storable form of grain, one that preserved flavor, resisted mold, and traveled well. Soldiers carried it. Priests blessed it. Brewers swore by it. And perhaps most curiously, no one really ate it on its own. Too hard on the teeth, Botsi says, tapping her molars. Some scholars speculate vapor was invented to solve the same problem that plagues pantry bread today, how to keep grain fresh in a wet climate without spoiling. Others argue it was developed to control alcohol content. By adjusting how much vapor was soaked, brewers could tweak sweetness, thickness, and strength. You watch as Botsi places a few pieces of vapor in a wide clay basin and pours warm water over them. The cakes begin to soften, sending up a smell like barley syrup and rain-damp hearthstones. It's oddly soothing. Like soaking old memories. Elsewhere in the brewery, others begin the second round of fermentation. Now that the mash is made, it must be left in tall, lidded jars to bubble quietly for days. The jars are huge, some as tall as your chest, and sealed with linen cloths and wax plugs. A few have notches carved into them, to indicate strength. The deeper the notch, the stronger the brew. It's a subtle system, but efficient. One jar in the corner has no lid at all. Botsi notices your glance. "That one's for the ghosts," she says simply. You wait for the joke. None comes. Apparently, Sumerians believed in offering a portion of every brew to the spirits of the household and the ancestors. It wasn't just tradition, it was insurance. You didn't want an angry ghost souring your batch. Or your luck. She hands you a dried fig, chewy and tart, and gestures for you to sit. You do. The brewery is still warm, but not hot. The air smells sweet and sleepy. You think about all the things that had to go right for this process to evolve: soaking, sprouting, baking, breaking, fermenting. It's astonishing, really. And yet it seems inevitable. All over the world, in every climate where grain could grow, people found a way to make it bubble. But only here, in this city of reeds, rivers, and sun-baked mud, did they do it with such ritual precision. Beer wasn't just food or drink. It was part of the contract between human and divine. There's a lull in the conversation. Botsi leans back against the shelf and closes her eyes. One of the brewery dogs yawns and stretches out beside her. A pot bubbles softly in the background. The whole place hums with quiet life. You don't speak. There's no need. You're not just witnessing history, you're fermenting in it. The moon outside is higher now, casting a pale glow through the latticework above the brewery's courtyard. You stretch your arms, still feeling the warmth of the fermenting jars behind you. Botsi, eyes half closed, shifts her weight and begins talking again, this time about the people who drank the beer. You might think everyone got their own cup, she says with a sleepy grin, but no, one jar, many straws. You blink, picturing the communal drink pots scattered around the city. It's true, Sumerian beer was thick and porridge-like, so serving it in individual vessels wasn't common. Instead, people sat around large jars, each person dipping in with their own straw, careful not to clink reeds. The image is somewhere between festive and mildly unhygienic. But remember, this is a world without glass, metal mugs, or personal tumblers. Even ceramic was costly. Sharing wasn't just social, it was practical. You learned that drinking together from a single jar wasn't just a family affair, it was also a civic one. City councils debated with straws in hand. Contracts were sealed after a round of shared brew. Some religious festivals ended with a communal sip, the god symbolically drinking alongside. And the longer you drank, the more the clay jar revealed its treasures. Beer sediment gathered at the bottom, rich, sour, and possibly more potent. This was where taste and texture converged in a murky layer of vitamins and starch. To some, it was the best part. To others, a gritty surprise. One scholar once joked that Sumerian beer was half smoothie, half soup, all trouble. Botsi says it differently, it doesn't just fill you, it settles into your bones. As you talk, one of her apprentices stumbles in, carrying a bundle wrapped in palm leaves. She unwraps it slowly, revealing 4 long, polished reeds, gleaming, patterned, tipped with tiny silver bands. Botsi raises her eyebrows. The temple straws, she murmurs, reverent. These weren't everyday drinking tools. These were ceremonial. Likely reserved for offerings to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer herself. You lean closer. They're cool to the touch, surprisingly ornate, etched with cuneiform prayers, perhaps protective spells or hymns of fermentation. Historians still debate whether such straws were used by humans, or placed in jars purely for symbolic consumption by the divine. Some think they were passed hand to hand during sacred rites. Others insist they were never meant to be touched once sealed into a pot of beer destined for the temple's inner sanctum. Either way, it's clear, in Sumer, the act of drinking beer was woven tightly with ritual and reverence. Botsi recalls that during the Akita festival, the Sumerian New Year, entire villages brewed special batches flavored with herbs and honey, storing them for weeks until the priests gave the signal. Everyone drank. Children sipped watered-down versions. Elders had first draw from the jars. Slaves were permitted extra rations. Even livestock got a bit, if you believe the older tales. The city would sing, and laugh, and forget the wars for a night. You wonder how many clay tablets were etched the next morning by scribes nursing hangovers. Speaking of scribes, Botsi gestures to another tablet mounted on the wall, its edges chipped. It's a hymn. Not just any hymn, but the Hymn to Ninkasi, one of the earliest known literary texts dedicated to the brewing process. Written in the 19th century BCE, it's part prayer, part recipe, and full-blown ode to alcohol. You read along as Botsi chants softly. Ninkasi, you are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. You are the one who bakes the bapper in the big oven. You are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. A shiver runs down your spine. The text feels alive, bubbling with rhythm and awe. Even now, 3,000 years later, it reads like a lullaby. Some scholars say the hymn was used to train apprentice brewers, like a musical manual. Others think it was recited during ceremonies. Either way, it shows how deeply the Sumerians revered their beer, not just as sustenance, but as craft, magic, and metaphor. Botsi runs a finger along the tablet's cracked surface. We're all just following instructions, she jokes. Thousands of years later. You laugh, but softly. Because somewhere in that moment, the distance between now and then vanishes. The hymn, the tools, the taste, they're all right here, echoing. Another apprentice enters, yawning wide enough to scare away flies, and begins checking the fermentation jars. She sniffs the linen lids, gently rocks each pot. Some are nearly ready for transfer to the cooling pits beneath the floor. Yes, cooling pits. Dug deep into the ground, these ancient cellars were filled with river stones and packed clay, staying several degrees cooler than the outside air. The beer was ladled into wide bowls and lowered by rope. It wasn't exactly refrigeration, but it worked. The beer would settle, separate, and mellow. You peer into one of the pits. A stone frog sits at the bottom, half buried in the dirt. For luck, Botsy explains. Or maybe just for company. And then there are the songbirds. You hadn't noticed them until now, perched on a wooden beam above. Small finches, chittering quietly, as if nodding along with the bubbling jars. Beer makes everything talk, Botsy mutters. Even birds. You lean back against the clay wall, eyelids drooping. The tools, the tablets, the goddess Ninkasi herself, they've all spoken tonight. In whispers of barley and water, in the sweetness of vapor, in the reed straws passed between friends and ghosts alike. And as the fermenting jars breathe in the cool air of the pit, you do too. You're not sure when you nod it off, but Botsy doesn't seem to mind. She's still at her workbench, grinding dried dates into a pulp, humming an off-key tune that may or may not be a lullaby. The air has changed, cooler now, tinged with the faint spice of cinnamon and warm clay. She slides a small wooden board your way. On it, 3 objects, a fragment of dried vapor, a charred barley husk, and a smooth piece of alabaster carved into a tiny mug. Guess which one was used to pay taxes, she says, raising an eyebrow. You blink. And that's your next surprise, beer wasn't just for parties and prayer. It was currency. Yes, in ancient Sumer, beer had value beyond the cup. Workers received beer rations as part of their wages. Laborers digging irrigation canals paid in grain and beer. Builders raising the temple ziggurat, beer again. Even administrators at the temple archives, the ancient bureaucrats, were allotted precise daily portions of the good stuff. In fact, entire tablets survive just to document how many jugs of beer were distributed to whom, and when. 2 silas of beer for the roof tiler, 1 for the fishmonger, half for the goat herder who brought his own tools. These records are written in neat cuneiform, with little pictographs showing jugs beside the names. Some of them even have notes complaining that certain individuals didn't finish their quotas or tried to substitute watered-down beer. A millennium-old version of workplace gossip, you suppose. And if you were wondering how strong this beer was, well, that's still up for debate. Historians argue over its alcohol content, with some suggesting it was mildly intoxicating, like a low-proof ale, while others insist some batches packed a punch. The truth likely varied by recipe and purpose. A festival brew might floor you in 3 gulps. A daily ration? Just enough to keep your spirits up while harvesting barley under the punishing sun. There are records of one temple rationing 8 liters of beer per day to its priests. 8. Whether they drank it all or used it in rituals is anyone's guess. Botsy just shrugs and says, priesthood had perks. As for the taxation side of things, the state had its own breweries. Managed by temple officials, staffed by workers, and closely monitored for production and purity. It was a controlled economy long before coins existed. Your beer wasn't just sacred, it was counted. You imagine a Sumerian merchant trying to pay a tax official. Here's your vapor loaf, and 2 reed straws to sweeten the deal. Sometimes beer was used in barter, traded for cloth, tools, livestock. Even marriage contracts listed beer provisions. A groom might offer the bride's family a certain number of jars as part of the dowry. No beer? No wedding. Of course, the temples and palaces didn't brew in the same way as the home brewers. They had scale. Giant vats, specially trained staff, and even designated beer scribes who tallied grain input versus output, watching for shrinkage. One surviving tablet even has a crude cartoon, a stick figure scribe, arms thrown up in dismay, with the beer jar toppled. Scholars aren't sure if it was satire or just someone doodling during a long audit. Either way, it's clear that even in the age of mud brick cities and reed straws, paperwork ruled. You stretch your legs and wander outside with Botsy. The night is soft now, with a pale mist curling above the alleyways. In the distance, you hear a lyre being played, a slow, almost melancholy tune drifting through the stone streets. It's a sound you've heard before, in dreams perhaps, or in a museum's headphones. Here, it feels entirely alive. Botsy points to a nearby building. That used to be a beer inn, she says. A tavern? Yes, but also no. More like, a beer corner. A place where you could drink, yes, but also hear gossip, strike a deal, propose a marriage, bribe a tax collector. Depends on the hour. She laughs gently. No fights, though. You get too rowdy, they take away your straw. This isn't just a joke, there are legal tablets that hint at tavern rules and disputes. Women often ran these establishments, by the way. Some widowed, some entrepreneurial, all savvy. It was one of the few recognized ways for women to earn a living independently. In fact, there's a fragment of a court case in which a beer seller was accused of shorting a customer. The argument? The straw had a knot in it, and the beer didn't flow properly. The judge fined her 2 shekels. You wonder if it was fair. Botsy just says, karma. Should have used better reeds. By now, the stars overhead are thick with silence, and the city seems to float in dream. Botsy gestures toward the brewery one last time. In the end, it wasn't about the drink. It was about the time you took to make it, the time you spent sharing it. That's what held the world together. You nod, feeling a warmth that isn't from the beer, or the hearth, or the baked air. It's something older. Something still fermenting inside you. You're part of the record now, a name without a tablet, a story whispered with barley breath, carried on a reed straw from mouth to mouth. And somewhere nearby, the lyre keeps playing that you're getting used to the rhythm now, the soft footfalls on the dust-hardened street, the way Sumerian nights wrap around you like gauze, the scent of crushed grain and river silt. And Botsy, ever the cheerful guide, now leads you toward a place she calls the Room of Questions. It's a small chamber tucked behind a temple annex, but instead of incense or idols, the walls are lined with rows of clay tablets. Not cuneiform records this time, but illustrations. Botsy hands you one with a grin. This is where the beer gods started getting creative. Tonight, you're exploring Sumerian beer deities. Yes, they had them. And yes, they were a little odd. The most famous was Ninkasi, goddess of beer and brewing, daughter of Enki and Ninti, which already places her in divine company. But Ninkasi wasn't just a figure to pray to before a wild night out, she was revered in temple hymns, sung to during the brewing process itself. And here's where things get charmingly weird. There exists a text, scholars call it the Hymn to Ninkasi, that isn't just religious praise. It's also a brewing manual in poetic form. The hymn gives instructions on how to prepare the vapor, how to soak the malt, and how to ferment the drink. All through song. You imagine Sumerian brewers humming it as they stir bubbling pots. A mashup of science, art, and worship. One passage might translate as, Ninkasi, you are the one who waters the malt on the large earth-covered floor. Doesn't exactly rhyme, but it does help you remember the order of operations. Botsy leans in conspiratorially. You hum it wrong, your batch turns sour. And just like that, we have the world's first musical recipe. The hymn is preserved on a clay tablet dating back to around 1800 BCE, although the brewing practices it describes may be much older. Some scholars argue it's a religious text cloaked as practical instruction, others think it's a brewer's guide dressed up to pass censors at temple school. Historians still debate whether temple priests were the exclusive keepers of brewing knowledge, or whether ordinary households could invoke Ninkasi in their own kitchens. Either way, her presence was ubiquitous. Images of her sometimes depict her holding a strainer or a ladle, always surrounded by jars. You get the sense she was both adored and feared. One wrong move, and you're offering a spoiled drink to a sacred guest. But she wasn't the only divine figure associated with beer. Dumuzi, the shepherd god and on-again off-again consort of Inanna, also pops up in beer rituals. Some myths describe him being welcomed back from the underworld with beer feasts. Symbolic, perhaps, of harvest and renewal. Or maybe Sumerians just believed no resurrection was complete without a good drink. There's also evidence that beer was poured as libation to other gods during temple rituals. Not just symbolic droplets, either. We're talking full jugs emptied into sacred channels, absorbed by the dusty earth and, presumably, by the divine. Botsi leads you over to a peculiar low table set with tiny clay bowls. She dips her finger in one and tastes. Sesame and date beer, she says. For the goddess who prefers sweetness. Some temples had different beer styles dedicated to different deities. Darker beer for storm gods. Honeyed beer for love goddesses. And strong, bitter brews for war deities, you know, something with a bite. One rare text even suggests that when a god was angry, the priests would brew an experimental batch with extra spices or herbs, an apology offering, basically, disguised as a cocktail. You try to imagine a god frowning at a recipe. Too much coriander. Smite them. Botsi finds this hilarious. Divine hangovers must be brutal. There are also traces of beer in myths surrounding death and the afterlife. One poem mentions a ghost who can't rest because she was never given a proper beer offering. Another suggests that beer helped the deceased find their way in the underworld, like a liquid compass. You take a long moment with that one. Even in death, beer mattered. But these weren't abstract beliefs. The beer was brewed, the straws were cut, and the rituals were enacted with precision. You feel it again, the way this culture weaved daily routine into cosmology. Brewing beer wasn't a side chore, it was a sacred act. Botsi pulls out a worn clay token shaped like a fish. This one, she says, was found buried next to a brewer's bones. Maybe a charm. Maybe a badge of honor. Or maybe he just really liked fish-flavored beer. No one knows. The question lingers, like yeast in the air. How much did these people believe? How much did they need to believe? And that's the beauty of it. You don't have to choose. The practical and the spiritual fermented together in the same vat. Grain and myth. Yeast and prayer. You sip one, and taste the other. The room grows quieter. The tablet light flickers softly, casting beer jug shadows across the walls. Outside, a distant jug breaks. Someone's had one too many hymns to Ninkasi, no doubt. Botsi stands, stretches, and gives you a sleepy smile. Tomorrow, she says, we talk about how the Sumerians recycled their leftover foam. You're not sure if she's serious. But at this point, you'd believe anything. You rise slowly, the stone tiles cool beneath your feet, and follow Botsi into the early morning haze. The temple compound has begun to stir, apprentices scrubbing bowls, elders lighting incense, but you are headed for a more unassuming corner, the brewery refuse pit. Yes, you heard that right. Welcome to the most unexpected part of your Sumerian beer journey, the recycling system. Sumerians didn't just toss their leftover mash into the Euphrates and call it a day. Oh no. Waste not, want not was practically a civic duty, especially when it came to the sacred business of beer. You find yourself standing beside a circular pit, rimmed in sun-baked clay, with the faint smell of sweet rot. Botsi offers you a ladle. Just smell, she says, unless you want to spend the day running in zigzags. You decline. Politely. Inside the pit, leftover vapor crumbs, foam skins, beer lees, the heavy, yeasty dregs that settled at the bottom of each jug. It's a murky, bubbling stew of nearly forgotten culinary utility. Because guess what? They used this stuff. Leftover vapor was sometimes re-dried and fed to animals. Sheep loved it. Goats didn't mind. Even pigs, where allowed, were reportedly fond of this boozy granola. Some scholars suspect the residue was used in secondary fermentation batches, like an ancient sourdough starter passed from jug to jug, generation to generation. Historians still argue whether these beer remains were used more for practical sustenance or for ritual purification, Botsy says, wrinkling her nose. I say both. A sacred sheep is still a sheep. Beer lees, rich in nutrients, also made their way into bread doughs. Hangover loaves, Botsy calls them, chuckling. You imagine biting into a dense, slightly fizzy cake and thinking, ah yes, fermented with regret. But it wasn't just livestock and breakfast that benefited. Some cuneiform records mention beer foam used as salve in rudimentary medicine. That's right, ancient skin care, Sumerian edition. Mash a little foam, add cedar oil, Botsy quotes from memory, dab on rash. Pray to Gula. Gula, goddess of healing. Probably the only deity who didn't demand a sip. Your mind boggles, not at the reuse itself, but the intentionality behind it. The Sumerians didn't view brewing waste as garbage, they saw it as residue with potential. There are even suggestions of proto-composting. In garden tablets from Lagash, notes appear about mixing beer waste into barley fields, for improved yield. Whether this was an early scientific insight or divine guidance from Ninkasi, no one's quite sure. But it worked. Fertile beer-brewed soil gave robust harvests. A circle of grain and foam. And speaking of circles, Botsy gestures toward a peculiar clay oven nearby. These, she says, were used to bake little puck-shaped fuel cakes. Want to guess the ingredients? You do not. But she tells you anyway. Vapor remains. Chaff. Dung. A little river mud. Cooked low and slow, she winks, for all your kitchen heating needs. You blink. So they brewed beer, fed animals, fertilized fields, made medicine, and cooked their lentils, all from the same mash? Botsy spreads her arms wide, dramatic. Sumerian efficiency, baby. It's surprisingly modern, this beer-to-table model. A zero-waste microbrewery 4,000 years before it became trendy. Yet what makes it charming isn't just the reuse, it's the little quirks. Take the drunken sheep rule. In the city of Umma, a poorly preserved law fragment reads, if a brewer sells lees to the herder, and the sheep falls, the brewer pays half the flock. Scholars still argue whether this means the lees were too strong, or if the herder was at fault for overfeeding. Either way, the ancient version of alcohol liability insurance. You chuckle softly. Imagining a court trial over tipsy livestock is exactly the kind of sleepy absurdity your brain now floats in with ease. Back in the brewery courtyard, a few young brewers are kneading grain patties into small domes and setting them out to dry. New batch of vapor, Botsy murmurs. Smells right. And suddenly you notice, the yeasty sweetness drifting through the air isn't just waste. It's transition. From old to new. From stale to sacred. There's a philosophical poetry in it. The Sumerians, who counted everything, every drop of grain, every shekel of barley, found ways to reincarnate their beer long after it was gone. The drink nourished, intoxicated, healed, even fertilized the soil that grew more grain. A closed loop. A slow wheel of civilization. Even the spent foam, even the faint fizz in the bottom of a cracked jug, it had its place. You wonder how much of modern life you throw away too soon. Botsy shrugs, as if reading your thoughts. We don't waste the dreams, either, she says. We pass them along. In the grain. In the hymn. And you feel the warmth of the oven, the rise of a new brew, and the soft fizz of stories retold. You lean against a sun-warmed brick wall as Botsy moves away, her sandals crunching lightly over the brewery's dusty courtyard. She leaves you with a final, cheeky, don't fall in the mash pit, and vanishes around the bend, off to consult clay tablets or pester an unlucky scribe. The morning has ripened into a low golden haze. Shadows stretch from clay vats like soft ink stains, and the sounds of the compound have shifted into a gentle rhythm, ladles stirring, jugs being sealed with wax, a wooden door creaking lazily. It's a perfect moment for wandering. So that's exactly what you do. You drift through the back lane behind the brewery and find yourself in the scribe's quarter. It smells like parchment, oil, and scorched rushes. And there, under a woven canopy, a figure hunched over a tablet grunts as you approach. "New?" he mutters, without looking up. You nod. "From the barley side." He chuckles. "Figured. You smell like fermentation and ambition. Meet Lugalisi. Part archivist, part gossip, and entirely too caffeinated for this sleepy corner of Uruk." He gestures to a wide stone slab upon which several clay tablets lie, some still damp, others stacked neatly and bound in reed twine. "These," he says, tapping one, "are the beer logs." You squint. Small wedges, carefully pressed, record line after line of brewery activity, grain allotments, brew strength, offerings, and a bizarrely long entry labeled simply, "Problems." "Someone once overboiled the mash," Lugalisi says, sighing. "We had froth dripping off the roof tiles. A disaster. But you know what they did? They invented beer syrup. Sold it as medicine for coughs. There it is again, Sumerian adaptation. Even a brew gone wrong could find a second life." He pulls out another tablet, older, darkened from fire. "Now this one," he says reverently, "this is where it gets sacred." You lean in. It's a hymn. A long, winding praise song to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Historians still argue whether this hymn was ever sung aloud, or simply inscribed as ritual memory, Lugalisi says. But either way, it's the first written beer recipe we've got. And he begins to recite. "Ninkasi, you are the one who bakes the bapper in the big oven. You are the one who waters the malt set on the ground." The words roll out like a lullaby, sung to no melody you know, but with the comforting cadence of a prayer repeated through centuries. You realize this hymn wasn't just a recipe. It was a memory system. An oral protocol, designed to encode precise instructions inside poetry. If you couldn't read, you could still brew, if you could sing. And suddenly, your work at the vats feels different. You weren't just stirring grain and guessing temperatures. You were reenacting a ritual from deep time. A choreography of barley and heat, remembered in verse. "Here," Lugalisi says, handing you a tablet with a grin. "Your turn." The clay is still soft. Unfired. Waiting. You dip a stylus and make your first mark. A line about foam. Another about the straw. The scribe leans back and smiles. That'll confuse someone in 5,000 years. Your laughter startles a chicken nearby. From this point forward, your day takes on a dreamy rhythm. A scholar's assistant waves you into a side chamber where sample jars rest in rows, ancient beer strains, preserved in wax and sealed in tight-necked flasks. You tilt one gently and watch thick liquid move like syrup. "This one's from Nippur," he says. "Still technically edible, if you hate yourself." Later, a brewer leads you through a blindfolded taste test, guessing different strengths by scent alone. You misidentify one as rancid soup, only to be informed it's a sacred blend. Oops. Evening nears. The courtyard glows with that gentle bronze Sumerian twilight, and the call of reed flutes carries faintly from a nearby shrine. You return to the brewery and notice something odd, a fresh offering bowl, placed neatly near the entrance. Inside it is a small loaf of bapper, a thimble-sized jug of golden beer, and a single, unbroken straw. "For Ninkasi," a brewer says softly. "So she doesn't forget us." You feel it, that flutter in the chest that comes when myth and daily life blur at the edges. Like maybe she really does walk among the jugs when the moon is right. Maybe she checks your mash for consistency and leans in to whisper when it's time to skim the foam. Beer wasn't just a beverage. It was a living thread. A song, a profession, a communal story pressed into clay and sung across the kiln-bright generations. The scribe's voice echoes in your head, you are the one who sets the fermenting vat on the fire. And suddenly, you're proud to be part of this strange, sacred business. You, the barley scraper. The foam stirrer. The sleepy apprentice with a stylus-stained hand. As stars appear above Uruk, and the courtyard cools, you find a quiet bench and sit. A jug of fresh beer rests beside you, thick, warm, slightly spicy from the last-minute addition of crushed dates. You lift the straw. Sip. It tastes like earth and fire. Like labor. Like legacy. And somehow, like home, the next morning arrives like a slow exhale. The kind of Sumerian dawn where nothing hurries, not the rising sun, not the breeze off the Euphrates, and certainly not your limbs, which feel mildly fused to the reed mat beneath you. Your shoulders ache faintly from yesterday's stirring, and your tongue tastes like a blend of roasted barley and regret. Welcome to day 2 of beer life. You stretch, blink toward the courtyard, and spot Botsy already hunched over a bubbling vat. She's stirring with the air of someone who's both deeply focused and just slightly annoyed at the existence of gravity. You're late, she calls, without looking up. You trudge forward, brushing barley chaff from your tunic. I'm timely in Babylonian hours. She smirks, then hands you a ladle. Stir clockwise. Unless you want the yeast gods to curse your love life. You take your position beside her, and together, you watch the thick brown mash swirl under your care. It's during this hypnotic process, one scoop at a time, steam rising in soft clouds, that Botsy begins explaining something curious. See this, she says, pointing to a second vat nearby, smaller, with a curious stone-weighted lid. That's for the fancy folk. Nobles. Priests. People who smell like sandalwood and don't sweat. You peer into the vat. The contents are thicker, the foam denser. What's different? Secondary fermentation, she explains. Extra vapor, filtered twice, a date infusion, and, if we're feeling generous, a splash of fig water. Historians still argue, she adds casually, whether this extra fancy version was actually stronger, or just perceived to be better because of the rituals around it. Either way, the elite got their own private blend. Served, of course, with their own private straws. Private straws? She leads you over to a small locked chest and produces something precious, an ivory cylinder, thin and carved with tiny spirals. For palace use only, she says, reverently. This one belonged to a vizier. Probably cost more than your entire life. You stare. It's beautiful, and ridiculous. A drinking straw that looks like it should play a flute solo at a royal banquet. Botsy shrugs. That's the thing about beer. It's communal, unless you're rich. Then it's performance. She places the straw back into its case and locks it with a tiny bone pin. But not everything is about nobles and their artisanal beer experiences. Across the courtyard, the workers are gathered in a circle, heads bowed over a curious object, a large jug, sealed with beeswax and a clump of string. Come see, calls a brewer, waving you over. You join the circle and find the jug being carefully unsealed. Inside, a mystery batch. Forgotten behind the granary, he says, grinning. 3 moons old. Might kill us. Or it might be the best thing you've ever tasted. A brave soul dips a straw in and sips. He pauses. Blinks. That's actually not bad. One by one, the workers pass the jug around, sipping cautiously. When it reaches you, the straw is warm from use, and the liquid inside is darker, thicker than normal. You sip. It tastes like sweet earth and slightly fermented apples. Smooth. A little funky. not unpleasant. They call it moon beer, both because of the age, and because no one's entirely sure how it formed. The fermentation must have gone rogue. But in a good way. From there, the rest of the morning tumbles gently by. You sort through barley sacks, help a clumsy apprentice mop up an overflow spill, and scrape crusted foam from the edge of the big vat. It's not glamorous, but there's a strange peace in the repetition. The smells and sounds become familiar, even comforting. At midday, Botsy gestures for you to follow. She leads you to a low table beneath the shade of a fig tree, where the master brewer awaits. He's an older man, with silver threading his beard and a nose that's clearly been broken once or twice in the name of taste testing. This, Botsy says, is where decisions get made. On the table are 3 bowls. Each contains a different beer sample. Your task: taste, describe, and suggest which batch is ready for temple delivery. You sip the first, nutty, warm, a little bitter. Second, sweeter, with a date aftertaste and faint bubbles. Third, flat, overly sour. You point to the second. The master brewer nods once. Correct. Botsy beams. Told you they had potential. He looks at you, expression unreadable. Then, you've got a tongue for gods. Not bad for someone who still sleeps through rooster calls. After that, he lets you sit with him as he writes out an offering list on a wax tablet: 10 jugs for Inanna's temple, 2 for the river priests, 1 for the scribes' festival. You realize that beer isn't just for drinking, it's for diplomacy. For worship. For ceremony. Even disputes between city-states were sometimes settled over shared vats. Beer smoothed out anger. Or at least, it made the shouting less efficient. Before you leave, the master places a hand on your shoulder and says, quietly, next week, you're tasting the goddess batch. You nod solemnly, though you don't yet know what that means. Evening again. The light turns syrupy and low. You walk home with Botsy, your sandals dusty, your fingers stained, your head full of barley and lyrics to Ninkasi's hymn. Tomorrow, she says, you learn the secret of the foam. You stop in your tracks. There's a secret? She smirks. Everything has a secret. Even the bubbles. And just like that, the work of brewing, of stirring, sipping, scribing, and sharing, begins to feel less like labor and more like initiation. Into what, you're not yet sure. But the wind smells like yeast and fig leaves, and your hands are steady on the straw. That's enough for now. Why now? You wake up not with confusion, but with expectation. There's a rhythm to beer life, and your body has learned the beat. Your feet swing off the reed mat before the rooster even begins its half-hearted crow. You rinse your face with cool water from the courtyard jar, pat your tunic into place, and arrive at the brewery just as the sun peeks over the rooftops, painting the plaster walls gold. Botsy is already there, naturally, crouched beside a frothy vat with a ladle in one hand and a small clay bowl in the other. She looks up, eyes narrowed mischievously. Ready to learn the secret of the foam? You nod solemnly, as if preparing for a sacred rite. Which, technically, you are. She hands you the ladle. Stir gently. Watch the bubbles. You dip the ladle and move it in slow circles. The top layer begins to ripple, shimmer, and finally settle into a ring of dense white foam with tiny, sticky bubbles that cling to the edges like over-affectionate frogs. This, Botsy says, tapping the foam with the back of a spoon, is called caskle. Some say it's just a byproduct of fermentation. Others believe it's where the goddess Ninkasi breathes. That each bubble carries her blessing. You pause, ladle in mid-stir. You're saying, the foam is holy? Not exactly. But it's definitely weird. According to one of the older brewers, foam behavior can predict the weather. A tight cluster of bubbles? Storms coming. Wide, frothy ring with slow pop. Clear skies and easy brewing. Historians still argue whether Sumerians actually believed this, Botsi admits, or if it was just the brewer's version of small talk. Either way, we all watch the foam. You lean closer. The bubbles are indeed hypnotic, rising, shifting, collapsing in slow, whispery waves. You could watch them for hours. And today, you basically do. Mid-morning, an elderly brewer named Garzu pulls you aside. He's famous around here, not just for having the most impressive beard in the guild, but also for claiming to have once seen a batch of beer foam itself into the shape of a lion. Was it a real lion, you ask, only half skeptical. It had ears, he replies. That's enough. You're beginning to realize that working in beer isn't just about barley and yeast. It's about watching, interpreting, believing. It's a bit like reading dreams, but with more bubbles. To test your skills, Botsi brings over 3 bowls of foam and asks you to describe each one. First, thick, tight bubbles, barely shifting. Too much vapor, she confirms. Will ferment too hot. Second, wild, frothy chaos, with islands of dryness. Probably got too much date paste, she says. Might explode. Third, soft dome, gentle swirl, clean rim. You smile. That's the one. Exactly, she says, pleased. You're getting it. By midday, you're tasked with skimming the foam from 3 different vats and saving it in a side bowl for later. Foam can be used in bread, Botsi explains. Or medicine, if you're desperate. Or rituals, if you're feeling dramatic. She leans in closer. Once, I saw a priest use foam to anoint a statue of Ninkasi before a festival. Didn't even drink it. Just wiped it across her stone mouth like she just had a sip. That mental image, of a divine beer-drinking statue, lodges itself firmly in your sleepy brain. And it doesn't end there. In the early afternoon, a visiting temple scribe arrives. He's preparing for a fertility rite and requires 2 jugs of high-foam brew. You and Botsi escort him to the back, where the bubbly batch waits. He sniffs the foam, nods, and declares, perfect. The gods will know we respect their froth. You blink. Their what? He smiles gently. Foam is breath. And breath is life. You glance at Botsi, expecting a wink or an eye roll. But she only shrugs. Some things are sacred. Others are just good poetry. Later, as the sun shifts into late afternoon mode, Garza the Elder returns to tell you one more story. Long ago, he says, a queen refused to drink beer unless the foam formed the shape of a lotus. Her brewer spent weeks trying to perfect the process, changing the grain, the water, even the straw. One day, the foam bloomed just right. She made him royal brewer on the spot. Did she marry him, you ask, naturally. Of course not, Garzu snorts. He smelled like yeast. By the time dusk rolls in, you feel oddly intimate with the idea of foam. It no longer seems like just froth, it's a surface layer of mystery. A signal. A soft exhale from a living thing. Back at your mat, you can still feel the warmth of the vat against your palms. You close your eyes and imagine the foam in perfect rings, drifting like clouds across a barley-scented sky. Botsi's parting words echo in your head, the beer speaks softly. But the foam shouts. Tomorrow, you'll learn about beer feasts. But tonight, let the bubbles hum you to sleep, you awaken to the sound of pounding drums, not war drums, thankfully, but festival ones. Steady, joyful thuds float over rooftops and reed fences like ripples across a lake. Today is a feast day, and your first experience with what Botsi calls the real reason we brew beer. You step out of the brewery and into a courtyard transformed. Clay pots line the walls, each one brimming with golden beer and marked with tiny palm leaf tags. Reed mats have been laid out in long rows, and wide canopies flutter above, providing blessed shade. The smell of roasting onions and sizzling goat fills the air. Botsy greets you with 2 cups and a grin. Time to learn beer's second job, making people happy. You nod, still sleepy. She passes you a cup, not for drinking yet, but for serving. Your task today is not brewing, but pouring. Hold the cup low, she instructs. Let it dribble out slow. Too fast and people think you're showing off. You practice on a dummy cup, then a real guest, then a line of increasingly chatty neighbors. Some clap after their pour. One woman slips you a date as a thank you. Soon, the courtyard fills with every sort of guest, old men with beet-stained beards, temple assistants in swishing linen, children already sticky with honey. Everyone has the same look, that rare, heavy-lidded smile of someone who knows the best part of the day is beginning. Beer brings the city together, Botsy says, balancing 3 cups on one hip like it's a party trick. Not temples. Not kings. This. And she's right. You notice the way enemies pretend to forget past arguments while sipping from the same jug. How even the city accountant, usually a walking thundercloud, laughs out loud at a pun about fish and barley. At the far end of the feast, a man with painted eyelids and gold-threaded sleeves raises a straw in the air. To the goddess Ninkasi, he calls. And her many, many bubbles. The crowd echoes the cheer, straw tips clinking against clay rims. You learn that straw etiquette is a whole art. There's the lazy spiral, where you turn the straw slowly while sipping, the quick tap, a brisk dunk and suck favored by older men, and the double sip, which involves a second person using the same straw right after you. Historians still argue whether the Sumerians found this hygienic or hilarious, Botsy quips, watching 2 priests engage in an especially awkward double sip. Personally, I think it's just a way to flirt. Between servings, you nibble on beer bread slices and pickled turnip wedges. Music flutes from a corner, reedy and aimless. A blind lyre player sings about a mythical brewer who once outdrank a river god. You catch only fragments, froth of stars, barley of destiny, and his liver like a sun-dried figure. You pour another cup. This one for a woman whose tattoos form a winding path from wrist to collarbone. She drinks deeply, then sighs, I remember when beer tasted of fire. You want to ask what she means, but she's already disappeared into the crowd. Botsy grabs your elbow. Come on. It's time for the straw dance. You don't ask, just follow. In the center of the courtyard, a small clay vat sits atop a platform. It's filled with bright golden beer, shimmering in the late sun. Around it, a dozen people gather with long straws. They insert the straws into the communal brew, and on cue from the drums, begin to sway. Yes, sway. With every sip, a soft step. With every pause, a lean or turn. It's not a fast dance, more a sleepwalker's rhythm, but it's oddly beautiful. You join in, straw in mouth, and let the beer's sweetness pull you into step. No one speaks. No one needs to. By evening, the vats are emptying, the music softens, and the guests lie half-draped across cushions, bellies full and cheeks flushed. Someone hums a lullaby to no one in particular. Botsy flops beside you, her braid trailing over the edge of a pillow. You see now, she whispers, why we make beer the way we do. You nod. It's more than nutrition or sacred duty. It's a kind of social glue, an edible lullaby, a fizzy peace treaty. As the stars begin their usual dance above you sip one final drop from your cup and feel something rare, a genuine, total ease. The kind that can't be bought or taught. Only brewed, the courtyard quiets to a gentle murmur as night wraps itself around you like a woolen shawl. Lanterns sway faintly in the breeze, their flames flickering in rhythmic conversation with the last plucks of the lyre. You find yourself seated on a reed mat, head resting against a wall still warm from the day's sun. The clay in your cup has cooled. Its contents, a final sip of beer, taste earthier now, mellow and thick with the last barley sediment. Botsy returns, balancing a platter of honeyed lentil cakes. A post-beer treat, she says, handing you one. Good for soaking up the dreaminess. You bite into it. The texture is soft, almost spongy. Sweetness mingles with something smokier, perhaps ash-baked date syrup. Around you, the guests move like sleepy constellations, gathering in slow pairs, drifting apart again, trailing laughter like stardust. Somewhere behind the temple walls, a priest begins the nightly chants to Ninkasi, thanking the goddess for fermentation, for friendship, for fullness. You ask Botsy, voice low and lazy, whether beer is ever used in rituals beyond festivals. She grins. Oh, definitely. There are rites where they pour it over idols, mix it with perfume, even bathe in it. Not the good beer, of course. The murky stuff reserved for symbolic messiness. She pauses to flick a sesame seed from her robe. Historians still argue whether those rituals were religious expressions or early forms of spa treatment. The breeze shifts. Somewhere nearby, a child is being sung to sleep with a tune about barley boats and moonlit silos. You let your eyes wander upward. The stars here are sharp, unlike in your modern life, where light drowns them. In UR, they stab through the sky like pins holding up a velvet canopy. You wonder how many drinkers before you looked up from a courtyard cup and saw the same scattering of glitter. Botsy leans over and whispers, "You want to see the archive?" You blink. The what? The beer tablets. Recipes, quantities, funny notes scribbled in cuneiform. We keep them under the brewery. Too sleepy to say no, you follow her through a narrow doorway behind the main hall. The air shifts from outdoor warmth to a cool, clay-scented quiet. Oil lamps line the tunnel, casting long shadows that sway like dancers. You duck under a low lintel and enter a vaulted room lined with shelves, each shelf packed with clay tablets. Thousands of them. All labeled in the familiar reed-stamped script. This one, Botsy says, holding up a wedge-shaped tablet, is my great-grandmother's record. She brewed 93 batches in 1 year and only lost 2 to mold. Not bad, huh? You trace the symbols with a hesitant finger. They're angular and neat, recording ingredients, ratios, perhaps even gossip. One corner has a faint imprint of a cat's paw. It's a kind of immortality, she says, returning the tablet gently to its spot. They say you die twice, once when your heart stops, and again when your name is spoken for the last time. These tablets fight the second death. It's a strange comfort, knowing that Sumerian beer wasn't just consumed, but recorded, tracked, loved enough to be immortalized in clay. You run your hand along the shelf, imagining each brew day, each mistake, each celebration folded into the archive. You glance at Botsy. Why straws, you ask, a question that's floated in your mind all day. She smiles. Because the beer's alive. It has layers, yeast on top, sweetness in the middle, dregs at the bottom. Straws help you sip the part you want. You nod. It makes sense. A tool not of laziness, but of precision. Of choice. And maybe, just maybe, of community. You leave the archive in silence, the weight of thousands of brewers echoing behind you. Outside, the courtyard has quieted to near stillness. A few linger, murmuring lullabies or tracing spirals in spilled beer with their fingers. You return to your mat. The stars have shifted slightly. The fire has dimmed to its sleepy embers. And as you close your eyes, you imagine the feel of straw between your lips, the fizz of barley and honey on your tongue, the hush of ancient voices in your ears. They're still here, you think. Every brewer, every drinker, every scribe who stamped barley ratios into clay. All of them gently whispering, across millennia. Drink. Breathe. Sleep. Now, everything softens. The fire crackles in low, lazy intervals, barely louder than a breath. The scent of clay and roasted grain lingers, but it's muted now, like the last sigh of a festival remembered in dreams. Your limbs are heavy, in the nicest way. The mat beneath you has taken your shape. The stars above you are twinkle slowly, as if even they are beginning to nod off. Somewhere in the distance, a flute stumbles into silence. The night deepens. The city rests. The brewery, for all its bubbling vats and bustling days, is silent now. And you're part of it. As steady and ancient as the walls, as sacred as the yeast-laced air. The goddess Ninkasi still watches, they say. Not with stern judgment, but with a sleepy smile. She sees the shared cup, the careful straw, the joyful stumble of a half-tipsy friend on feast night. And she approves. Let yourself fall now. Gently. Like foam sliding down the side of a jug. Like barley settling to the bottom of the brew. Like history itself, layer upon layer, making peace with the night. There's nothing more to do. No more to remember. Only stillness. Only dreams. Sleep well. Did you fall asleep before the end? Comment below.